There is a version of your life where everything you currently beg for arrives without a fight, not because the world softened, not because luck finally noticed you, but because you became a different kind of person, the kind the world cannot help but hand things to. Most people never reach that version of themselves, and the reason is almost embarrassing once you see it clearly. They spend their entire lives trying to control everything except the one thing that would actually change their results. They try to control other people's opinions. They try to control outcomes they have no authority over. They try to control the market, the weather, the traffic, the boss, the ex, the algorithm, and the one variable that was always within reach, the only one that was ever truly theirs, sits untouched, themselves. Here is the contradiction nobody tells you about growing up. You were taught that self-control means restriction, less food, less spending, less pleasure, less of everything that makes life feel alive. So somewhere along the way, you started treating self-mastery like a punishment, a cage you step into when you've failed enough times to deserve it. But that is exactly backwards. Self-control was never a cage, it was always a key, and the door it opens is not a door to less. It's a door to more trust, more opportunity, more respect, more clarity, more money, in the hands of the kind of person who can actually keep it. More freedom, which is the strange, ironic reward waiting on the other side of discipline, the very thing people avoid because they think it will trap them. So here is the real question hiding underneath the title of this exact idea. Why does life seem to reward the very people who need the least from it? Why does the calm, controlled, unreactive person keep receiving doors that the desperate, reactive, undisciplined person keeps watching close? That is what we're going to take apart, piece by piece, until you can see the machinery underneath it. Not motivation, mechanism. Minds. Because once you understand the mechanism, you stop waiting for life to change. You start becoming the kind of person life has no choice but to respond to differently. Let's start with the actual problem, because most people never correctly diagnose it. They think their problem is circumstance. Not enough money, not enough time, not enough connections, not enough luck. But underneath every one of those complaints is a single, quieter admission that almost nobody says out loud. I do not fully control my own reactions. I do not fully control my own mind. I am in some private way being run by something other than my own decision. Think about how much of a normal day is spent in reaction rather than direction. A comment stings, and the whole afternoon shifts. A notification buzzes and attention scatters. A craving appears, and discipline that took weeks to build collapses in under a minute. None of these moments feel significant on their own. That's what makes them dangerous. They're small enough to excuse and frequent enough to define a life. Here's the deeper layer most people miss entirely. It isn't the big collapses that determine a person's future. The one relapse, the one blow-up, the one impulsive decision everyone remembers. It's the thousands of tiny surrenders nobody witnesses. The extra 10 minutes of scrolling instead of starting. The comment you didn't need to make. The apology you gave away just to avoid tension, even when you were right. Each one seems too small to matter. But a mind that consistently loses small battles cannot be trusted with large ones. And other people can sense that, even if they never articulate it consciously. This is the internal problem behind almost every external complaint. Not life isn't giving me enough, but I haven't yet built a self capable of holding more. Now here is where the hidden principle begins to reveal itself, and it is more radical than most self-help conversations are willing to admit. Self-control is not primarily about behavior, it is about information. Every time you control an impulse, every time you choose the response instead of letting the reaction choose you, you are sending a signal, first to your own mind, and eventually to the world around you. The signal says, I am the one in charge here, not my appetite, not my anger, not my fear. Me. This matters because your subconscious mind, whether you've ever thought about it this directly or not, is always listening to your behavior for evidence of who you actually are, not who you say you want to be. It doesn't listen to your goals, it listens to your patterns. And when the pattern says I break easily, the subconscious builds an identity around that evidence, then quietly protects that identity by keeping you inside its limits. You've felt this before. You've set a goal with real enthusiasm, only to find some invisible ceiling pulling you back toward what feels like you. That ceiling isn't fate, it's accumulated evidence, collected one small surrender at a time, and self-control is the only force capable of rewriting it. This is where a distinction becomes important, because it separates people who transform from people who merely try. There is a difference between suppression and mastery. Suppression is clenching your jaw and forcing yourself through gritted teeth, white-knuckling your way past a craving while the desire itself stays exactly as loud as before. It works for a while, and then it collapses, often violently, often at the worst possible time, because suppression doesn't change the underlying want, it just delays the moment the want wins. Mastery is different. Mastery doesn't fight the impulse in the moment of temptation. It reshapes what the mind finds automatically desirable, long before the moment of temptation ever arrives. This is closer to what Hill was pointing toward when he described the discipline of thought, not gritting your teeth against a single decision, but training the mind, through repetition, to want the things that build you rather than the things that flatter you for a moment and cost you for a decade. Picture two men standing at the exact same crossroads. Both are offered a shortcut that would compromise something they claim to value. A partner walking away from a deal that isn't quite honest. An entrepreneur tempted by a customer they could quietly overcharge. Someone shaving 15 minutes off a job that will never technically be checked. The first man wants to take the shortcut and forces himself not to, standing there in visible tension, resenting the restraint even as he exercises it. The second man doesn't feel much tension at all, because somewhere earlier, through hundreds of smaller decisions, he trained his mind to no longer find the shortcut appealing in the first place. Both men, from the outside, appear equally disciplined in that single moment, but only one of them will still be standing there making the same choice 10 years later, because only one of them changed what he actually wants. That is the difference between willpower and identity. Willpower is a battle you fight. Identity is a battle you no longer have to fight, because you've already become someone the old battle doesn't apply to. Now, this raises the obvious question, how does anyone actually get from the first man to the second? Because knowing the difference between suppression and mastery doesn't automatically produce mastery. This is where the mechanism deepens, and where most people stop paying attention right when it matters most. The transformation happens through repetition of thought, not through a single decision. This is the part people resist, because it isn't dramatic. Nobody wants to hear that becoming a different kind of person is mostly a matter of quiet, unremarkable repetition, thinking the same disciplined thought in the same disciplined direction, day after day, long enough for it to stop feeling like a thought and start feeling like a fact about who you are. But that is precisely how belief is built. Belief is not a single conviction that strikes you like lightning. Belief is repetition that is hardened into certainty. Consider how a fear takes root. Nobody sits down and decides, logically, to be afraid of failure. It accumulates, one embarrassing moment repeated in the mind at 2 a.m., one criticism replayed 100 times, one rejection turned into a story that gets told and retold until the story becomes indistinguishable from truth. The fear was never installed all at once. It was installed through repetition. And here is the liberating part of that same mechanism. If repetition can install a fear you never consciously chose, repetition can just as deliberately install a discipline you do choose. The subconscious mind does not check whether a thought is true before absorbing it. It only checks whether the thought has been repeated with enough emotional intensity and enough consistency to be treated as settled. This is the actual mechanism behind autosuggestion, stripped of the mystical language it sometimes gets wrapped in. It isn't magic, it's engineering. You are, whether you intend to or not, constantly feeding instructions to the part of your mind that runs on autopilot, through what you say to yourself after a mistake, through what you rehearse in your imagination before a hard conversation, through the identity you silently assume every time you catch yourself in the mirror. The only real choice available to you is whether that programming happens on purpose or by accident. Most people are being shaped by accident, one unexamined thought at a time, and then wondering why their outer life keeps mirroring an inner chaos they never consciously agreed to. Once thought becomes conviction, conviction shapes decision. This is the next link in the chain, and it explains why two people with identical information can make opposite choices. Information alone has never been enough to change behavior. If it were, no smoker would ever light a second cigarette after reading the warning label. What actually determines the decision is the conviction sitting underneath the information. Does this person believe, at the identity level, that they are someone who follows through, or someone who eventually gives in? The decision simply reveals which conviction was already installed, and decision, repeated, becomes habit. This is where most people quietly misunderstand what habit even is. They think of habit as a technique, a system, a checklist, an app that tracks streaks, but habit is downstream of identity, not the other way around. You do not become disciplined by finding the right habit tracker. You build the habit because, somewhere earlier, you made a decision about who you are, and the habit is simply that decision playing out automatically, without requiring fresh willpower every single day. This is why people who rely purely on motivation burn out, while people who built identity barely notice the effort. Motivation asks, do I feel like doing this today? Identity has already answered that question in advance. And here we reach the final, most consequential link. Habit becomes identity, and identity produces outcome. Not instantly, not dramatically, but with a kind of quiet compounding inevitability that most people underestimate because it doesn't announce itself. Nobody wakes up one morning transformed. They wake up one morning and realize, almost as an afterthought, that the person they've become for the last several years has already produced a life unrecognizable from where they started, and the change happened so gradually that no single day felt like the turning point, even though every day was. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it explains something people often get backwards. They assume outcome comes first, that once they have the money, the recognition, the security, then they'll finally become calm, controlled, disciplined. But it works in the opposite direction. The self comes first. The outcome is simply what a particular kind of self tends to produce, the way a particular kind of soil tends to produce a particular kind of crop, regardless of which seeds happen to blow across it in any given season. Now we arrive at the part of this that sounds almost unbelievable until you've watched it happen enough times to stop doubting it. The way self-control changes not just your internal world, but the actual behavior of the world around you. Here is the honest mechanism, with no mysticism attached to it. People are constantly, instinctively scanning each other for reliability, because reliability is what determines who gets trusted with more. A business partner does not extend a larger opportunity to someone who has shown, through pattern, that they cannot hold a smaller one. A mentor does not invest deeper wisdom in someone who has already demonstrated they'll waste the wisdom they were already given. Even in the most personal relationships, people instinctively give more of themselves, more vulnerability, more commitment, more resources, to the person whose emotional weather is stable enough to be trusted with it. This is not mysticism. This is pattern recognition, and every human being does it constantly, mostly unconsciously. A person who reacts explosively to minor inconveniences signals, without saying a word, that they cannot be trusted with major ones. A person who stays composed under pressure signals the opposite, and composure, repeated consistently, becomes a kind of currency that opens doors panic never could. This is why the calm person in the room often ends up with disproportionate influence over decisions, even without formal authority. Calm reads as competence, whether or not it technically is, because our nervous systems are wired to trust stillness over chaos when stakes are high. So when self-control changes your internal identity, it inevitably changes your external signal, and other people reading that signal begin extending you the exact things a reactive, undisciplined identity would never have been trusted with. This is the actual machinery behind the idea that life gives more to the disciplined. It isn't superstition. It's the accumulated effect of pattern recognition happening in every person you encounter, whether they could articulate it or not. But there's a deeper layer still, one that has nothing to do with how other people perceive you, and everything to do with what you become capable of perceiving yourself. An undisciplined mind is a loud mind. It's constantly narrating anxiety, replaying old grievances, negotiating with itself about whether today is finally the day it starts. And a loud mind cannot notice quiet things, the early signal of an opportunity before it becomes obvious to everyone else, the subtle shift in a conversation that reveals what someone actually needs, the small idea that arrives at an odd hour and gets dismissed because the noise of the day drowned it out before it could be examined. This is close to what Hill pointed toward when he described a kind of sixth sense, not something supernatural, but something available only to a mind quiet enough and disciplined enough to actually hear it. A reactive mind is too busy putting out fires to notice the door quietly opening 2 rooms away. Self-control then does something almost paradoxical. It doesn't just change what other people offer you, it changes what you're actually capable of perceiving and receiving in the first place. A disorganized, reactive person could be standing directly in front of the exact opportunity they claim to want, and walk straight past it, because their internal noise made them blind to it. The disciplined person isn't luckier. They're simply awake in moments where everyone else is asleep at the wheel of their own attention. Now, none of this happens without confronting something Hill was almost obsessive about naming directly, because he considered it the single greatest saboteur of human potential, fear, and its quieter, more socially acceptable cousin, indecision. Here's what fear actually does, mechanically, inside a mind that hasn't yet mastered itself. It doesn't just make you avoid the frightening thing, it makes you avoid deciding at all. Because indecision feels safer than the risk of being wrong. And indecision, repeated over years, becomes drifting, a life lived reactively, one circumstance responding to the next, with no defining shape because no defining decision was ever actually made. This is perhaps the most dangerous form of self-sabotage, precisely because it doesn't feel like sabotage. It feels like patience. It feels like waiting for the right moment. But a mind still governed by fear will always find a reason the moment isn't quite right yet, indefinitely, because the fear was never actually about timing. It was about avoiding the discomfort of commitment. Definiteness of purpose is the direct antidote to this, not as a slogan but as a mechanism. A mind with a clearly defined purpose has already answered in advance most of the small decisions that would otherwise require fresh willpower every single day. Should I have the extra hour of sleep or the early start? Should I take the meeting or protect the focused block of work? A person without a defined purpose has to relitigate these questions constantly, and every relitigation drains a small amount of the same discipline they need for the decisions that actually matter. A person with a defined purpose has already decided, once in a calmer moment, and simply executes the decision when the moment arrives, which is precisely why they seem to have more discipline than everyone else. They aren't fighting more battles. They're fighting fewer, because most of the battles were already resolved in advance. This is where persistence enters the picture, and it's worth being precise about what persistence actually is, because it gets romanticized into something it isn't. Persistence is not raw stubbornness. It is not refusing to adjust course when the evidence says you should. Persistence is the refusal to let a single failure, a single setback, a single moment of fear, override a decision that was made with a clear mind in a calmer moment. This distinction matters enormously, because it explains why persistence and self-control are, in practice, almost the same skill wearing two different names. Both are the discipline of staying loyal to your best thinking, even when a worse, louder, more emotional version of yourself shows up demanding a shortcut. Here is where the internal enemy reveals its final disguise, because fear rarely announces itself as fear. It shows up as reasonableness. It shows up as "I'll start Monday." It shows up as needing one more course, one more piece of information, one more sign before committing to the thing you already know you need to do. This is the most sophisticated form of self-sabotage precisely because it wears the costume of responsibility. And the only real defense against it is a mind trained, through repeated small decisions, to recognize the difference between genuine preparation and fear disguised as preparation. Let's take this out of the abstract for a moment, because principle without a picture tends to evaporate the moment the video ends. Imagine someone early in their career, capable, intelligent, but constantly reactive, quick to defend themselves in meetings, quick to take feedback personally, quick to let a bad morning bleed into an entire unproductive day. For years they wonder why less talented colleagues keep getting chosen for the opportunities they secretly believe they deserve more. It would be easy to conclude the system is unfair, that politics decided everything, that luck simply favored other people. And there might be some truth scattered in those explanations, but underneath all of it sits a quieter, less comfortable truth. Nobody trusted this person with more, because their pattern hadn't yet demonstrated they could be trusted with what they already had. Now imagine the shift, not a single dramatic transformation, but a slow rebuilding, one controlled reaction at a time, staying composed in a meeting where the old self would have gotten defensive, following through on a small commitment nobody would have noticed if it slipped, choosing repeatedly the response that the future version of themselves would be proud of, rather than the reaction the present wounded version of themselves wanted. None of these moments look significant individually, but they were accumulating into evidence, first for their own subconscious mind, and eventually for everyone watching. And at some point, without any single dramatic turning point, that same person found themselves being handed responsibility they hadn't even had to ask for, because the pattern had finally changed, and other people, consciously or not, had noticed. This is not a guarantee, and it would be dishonest to present it as one. Discipline does not override every external circumstance, and pretending otherwise would be exactly the kind of false promise this principle warns against making. But discipline changes the odds, consistently, over a long enough timeline, in a way that undisciplined reaction never can. It is the difference between a life shaped mostly by what happens to you, and a life shaped mostly by what you decide in advance you will become regardless of what happens to you. There's one more layer worth naming directly because it's the layer that separates people who understand this principle intellectually from people who actually live inside it. Self-mastery is not primarily about restraint from things you want. It's about becoming someone whose wants have changed. The disciplined person isn't white-knuckling their way past temptation their whole life. Eventually, if the repetition is genuine, the temptation itself begins to lose its grip, because the identity underneath it has shifted. The question stops being "how do I resist this?" and becomes "why would I even want this anymore?" That shift, from resisting a want to no longer having it, is the actual finish line, even though almost nobody talks about it, because it doesn't photograph well as a before and after. It's quiet, it's internal, and it's the only version of discipline that actually lasts. Ends. So what does this look like, practically, stripped of abstraction? Not a rigid system, because rigid systems tend to collapse the first time life gets complicated, but a set of honest daily practices, mental exercises and decisions that, repeated, begin to do the quiet work of rebuilding identity from the inside. It starts with noticing the small surrenders, not judging them harshly, but simply becoming aware of them, because awareness is the precondition for change. The extra scroll, the comment you didn't need to make, the apology given away just to avoid discomfort. You cannot redirect what you refuse to notice. It continues with making fewer, clearer decisions in advance, rather than relitigating the same questions daily under pressure. Decide, in a calm moment, who you are and what you do, and then, when the moment of temptation or fear arrives, you are not deciding anymore. You are simply executing a decision your calmer self already made on your behalf. It requires deliberately choosing the harder, quieter discipline over the louder, easier relief, not because difficulty is virtuous for its own sake, but because every time you choose it, you are casting a vote for the identity you are trying to become. An identity, as we've already established, is built one vote at a time. It asks you to guard your imagination the way you'd guard anything else valuable. Because whatever you rehearse in your mind, anxiously or confidently, chaotically or clearly, becomes the blueprint your behavior eventually follows. A mind that constantly rehearses failure is quietly building failure's foundation, one imagined scenario at a time, regardless of what its owner says out loud about wanting success. And it requires patience with the timeline, because nothing about this compounds quickly at first. The early period of self-mastery often feels like nothing is happening, no dramatic reward, no visible shift, just quiet repetition that seems to be going nowhere. This is precisely the period most people quit in, right before the compounding becomes visible. The tragedy isn't that self-control doesn't work, it's that most people abandon it in the exact window where it was about to start working, because they mistook slow accumulation for no accumulation at all. Now return for a moment to the opening idea, because it means something different now than it did at the start. The more you control yourself, the more life gives you. It sounds on the surface like a tidy motivational phrase, the kind of thing that gets printed on a poster and forgotten by lunch. But underneath it is a precise mechanism, one link connecting to the next. Thought, repeated, becomes conviction. Conviction shapes decision. Decision, repeated, becomes habit. Habit becomes identity. And identity, quiet, consistent, demonstrated identity, is the single thing the world actually responds to, far more than talent, luck, or desperate effort ever could. Not because the universe is keeping score in some mystical ledger, but because every person around you, every opportunity, every open door, is being guarded, consciously or not, by the same simple question: can this person be trusted with more than they currently have? And the only honest way to answer that question for yourself or for anyone else is pattern, repeated, demonstrated, unglamorous pattern. So the real transformation this idea points toward was never about controlling everything outside you. It was never about forcing the world to hand over what you wanted through sheer will. It was about becoming, quietly and repeatedly, the kind of person the world could not help but trust with more, because you had already proven, in 1,000 small unwitnessed moments, that you could be trusted with what you already had. Who could you become, if you actually lived this, not for a week of enthusiasm, but for years of quiet repetition? Not someone who fights themselves into submission every single day. Someone who no longer has to, because the war was already won at the level of identity, long before the moment of temptation ever arrived. That is the person life keeps opening doors for, not because they demanded it, because they had at some point quietly become someone the door recognized. The choice in front of you was never really about the next decision. It was about which self is making it.